So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today in our session on administrative burden in behavioral science. So my name is Mary McLennan. I'm the Senior Advisor in Behavioral Science in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I also lead an initiative called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which I'll come to shortly. So today we're joined by an esteemed panel. We're very excited to have them. Before we get into our content for today, just wanted to share a bit of background with respect to behavioral science in the UN for those of you who are new. So the Behavioral Science Group brings together over 1,000 UN colleagues from more than 60 entities in 110 countries. So it's quite a big and diverse group, ranged not only in terms of geographies, but in terms of domains as well, from health, climate, gender, peace, and security. So lots of different spaces. Now, most colleagues in the group, although we have some are advanced, most are in the early stages of their journey in behavioral science. So thinking through how to apply it, one project to two projects, and we'll include some resources in the chat for those of you who maybe are not part of the group just yet, but who would like to join. You don't need to be part of the UN to join the group. You can join as an observer, and we'll maybe speak to that a bit as we go throughout the session today. So in addition to the working level colleagues across the UN system, we also have quite strong support from the Secretary General with respect to behavioral science application. Secretary General has called behavioral science a critical tool for the UN to progress on its mandate, and also strongly encourages entities to work together in this space. So there's lots of interest and enthusiasm from that level of the UN as well. Okay, so there's some links in the chat, as I mentioned, to check out some of the documents and reports and some background. You can join the Behavioral Science Group also if you follow those links. And then we also have a Twitter account if you would like to follow us there. So any questions or comments about behavioral science in the UN, feel free to drop them in the chat. And yeah, so we'll get on for this session today. We'll hear from our panel, our speakers. So we'll have about 30 minutes of presentation and lots of time for Q&A with all of you. So we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. So not the chat, but the Q&A box. And then there you can also upvote the questions of your colleagues. And it'd be great to have the questions there that we can kind of get the most from the audience in terms of interest and engagement. So with respect to our panel today, we'll be hearing from, first of all, Lucie Martin, who's with us in the UN Behavioral Science team. She's a fellow, which is part of the UN Innovation Network and the Executive Office of the Secretary General. And then we'll hear from some colleagues who've been working in this field for a number of years from the New South Wales government, who are leaders in this space. So Eva, Selena, and Alex, and they'll speak to some of their work in that space overall. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lucie. Over to you.
Thanks, Marian. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to share with you today a little bit about what the UN is doing with regards to administrative burdens before I hand it over to the New South Wales team. So the first thing to say about administrative burdens in the United Nations is that the Secretary General has specifically highlighted their importance and their potential as an area of application for behavioral science. So in particular here, you can see some text from the Secretary General's guidance note on behavioral science, and you can see that there's a whole section on applying behavioral science to reduce administrative burdens. So what could that look like? As you can see, the first bullet point is about applying behavioral science to identify and reduce excessive administrative burdens, for example, to remove barriers in accessing programs for UN beneficiaries and so on by simplifying and improving processes. And one of the ways that this is highlighted is by conducting sludge audits, and that is something that Eva, Selena, and Alex will be able to tell you more about. Another area of application is not just in making programs easier to access, but also in terms of redesigning and improving internal administrative systems with regards to management, administration, support services, and so on. Of course, another clear area of application is to reduce manual paperwork requirements, and this might be through digitization, automation, and also improving ICT systems in general. And just more broadly, you can think about administrative burdens reduction and behavioral science in terms of just generally improving approaches to business processes by using evidence-based methods. And you'll hear a bit more about that today as well. So in short, we can use behavioral science to remove excessive administrative burdens at the UN across different contexts, both program-focused and internal processes-focused. And this is something that the Secretary General wants to prioritize as part of the application of behavioral science. Now, what might this actually look like in practice? So on this next slide, I will show you an example from the World Bank. So this is a behavioral science project that was done as part of a broader cash transfer program done in Bangladesh. And the aim of this program was to provide microloans to widows and elderly women in Bangladesh, but also more generally to provide sort of social interaction for these women, make sure that they are not isolated, and so on. And so a big part of the program was for the social worker to visit these women's homes regularly and sort of course, get an update on the loan and repayments, but also provide social support and just see how they're getting on, right? But then what they noticed was that actually the problem was the excessive administrative burden placed on both the UN worker and these women beneficiaries of the microloan program. Because what was happening is most of the visit from the social worker was being spent filling out a long loan repayment form. And doing all of this paperwork meant there was no time left for the social worker to actually have quality interactions with the program beneficiaries. So what did they do to cut the administrative burdens? They designed a short and very, very simple loan repayment card to replace the long and overly complex form. And you can see the card here on the left, but if you're like me and you don't speak Bengali, it's translated here on the right. And you can see that they only really needed 4 pieces of information: the installment number, the date, the name, the village, and how much was being repaid. And that's really all they needed to know. So why does this matter? Why is it useful, and why does it change outcomes to reduce administrative burdens? Well, simply by redesigning this form, what happened was 12 extra hours per week of the social worker's time were freed up. And these 12 hours could now be spent on quality interactions and social support with the program beneficiaries. So what happened here is the World Bank identified an excessive administrative burden, redesigned the process to reduce this burden, and this led to improvements both for the UN worker and for the program beneficiary by saving a lot of time and reducing the paperwork to what is actually essential. Now, let me show you another example. This one is in internal administrative burden reduction. So on the next slide, you can see that this project is actually about reducing administrative burdens that make it harder for people to attend UN employee training. So this is a project that we did with the Food and Agriculture Organization as part of the UN Innovation Network Behavioral Science Fellowship. And the aim of this project was to understand what sort of burdens were keeping people from attending these trainings and what we could do about it. So basically, the Food and Agriculture Organization provides compensation benefits to their employees. So if they get into an accident or they get sick on the job, then FAO will compensate them financially as part of their duty of care as their employer. And most UN agencies, as far as I'm aware, offer a comparable benefit. So this is relevant across the UN system. But very few people claim this benefit. And one big issue that we had identified was that although there is training, so people can learn about the benefit and be ready to apply, few people actually attend. And so it seemed like there was low awareness or understanding of the training and of the benefits. So we wanted to reduce administrative burdens to encourage attendance to this benefits training. And as a side note, we're also doing ongoing work on internal administrative burdens for example, we are doing a sludge audit with the UN office at Geneva, and that's something we can also discuss later on if you like. But for this example, I'll show you on the next slide how we actually went about this project. So we started by collecting a lot of data from interviews, reviewing training materials, training announcements, and so on, to understand the user's behavioral journey to attending training and identify specific administrative burdens at each step of the journey. So if you wanted to attend this training, you would have needed in the original process to log onto the internet or onto the internal social media. So already the burden is on you to go and find out this information. You would also need to spot and take the time to read the training announcement. So again, there might be complexity, there might be time constraints that makes that more difficult for you. You would have to decide to actually attend, pick the session date and see how it works with your own time constraints, your time zone and so on. And there's many considerations in deciding to attend. Maybe you just don't have the time, it's not a priority. Maybe there is present bias that makes you think, oh, I'll go to the next session, but then you sort of never end up doing it and so on. You then have some implementation costs. You need to write down the date, the local time, save the link to the training somewhere. And once you've done that, you also need to remember to actually attend on the day. Find the link, click, and attend. So as you can see, there are quite a few administrative burdens that interact with behavioral factors to make it more difficult for us to attend. So what can we do about that? As I'll show you in the next slide, we designed a behaviorally informed calendar invitation to the training. So one big consequence of this is now, instead of having to go and look on the intranet, the invitation was directly into people's calendar with a nice Outlook notification. So that meant by default, they were now aware of the training. There was no need to go and look for things. We used a short and descriptive title to make it more salient to people. Because of the feature of Outlook, the date and the local time in your own time zone was now automatically saved, and the link was right there, easy to find, no need to note it down. We also made sure to have a recognizable, trustworthy messenger, the HR social benefit team. And thanks to Outlook, again, there was an automatic reminder so that even if people forget, it's not a problem. And we tested 2 different versions of the actual text of the invitation. Both of them were behaviorally informed, but one of them, which we'll call the simple behavioral invitation, focused on a very salient and simple message with a call to action to make it clear what we wanted to ask people, with simple language and plain English, and so on and so forth. Whereas the second version, which we'll call the behavioral enhanced invitation, also used some nudge messages, making use of reciprocity by saying, we have booked you a place, so maybe, you can also do something proactive by attending, and by using loss aversion, by saying, don't miss out on this training and potentially on benefits, and so on. So there was lots more to it, but that's just a summary of what the invitation looked like. And now for the results, in the next slide, you can see that us sending this invitation increased training attendance tenfold. So we tested this via a randomized control trial, and the group that was business as usual, so that had to go through the user journey that I walked you through, finding the notice on the intranet, noting down the details and so on, about 2% of this group attended. Whereas in contrast, between 18 and 20% of people in the treatment group, in the group that received the simple or enhanced behavioral invitations, attended. So this means a tenfold increase in attendance. So obviously this was a nice result and a very powerful intervention. But what's even more interesting is that through this project, we identified a lot of different sort of broader application areas. For example, using behavioral science to reduce administrative burdens in other trainings or in other parts of these benefits in terms of making claiming this benefit easier and simpler and so on. So we learned a lot from this project more generally. So that was just a very sort of quick introduction to why administrative burdens matter at the UN and some examples of what we've done so far. And now for a more in-depth explanation of the behavioral principles and some methods to reduce administrative burdens, I'll hand it over to Eva, Alex, and Selena for their part of the session.
Great, thanks for that, Lucie. Over to you.
Thank you, Lucie and Mary. What a great case study that was. I always love when people talk through a study and actually show you the artifact in detail and all the principles behind it. That was awesome. And yeah, thank you for the warm welcome, and thanks for the great work and thought leadership you guys are providing in this space. It really is world leading. And thanks to everyone online. We're really excited to get the chance to connect with you all as community of practitioners that are interested in reducing admin burden in your organisations, and keen to learn from you as well. So I want to start by just quickly acknowledging and honouring the First Nations people on whose land we're coming from today. So for me in Western Sydney, that's the land of the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation. I just want to pay my respects to elders past and present. Today, Alex, Selena and I are going to talk to you about the work we're doing in reducing sludge within New South Wales government in Australia. And we're going to start with giving you a bit of an overview of how we define sludge. So sludge is, broadly synonymous with administrative burden, but there's a bit of a few other dimensions to the way that we define it and how we think about it in terms of our role in meeting the customer where they're at. And we'll also talk to you a bit about the sludge audit method that we've developed and we're using across New South Wales government to reduce administrative burden across our services. So I'll hand over to Alex to kick us off. Thanks, Alex.
Great, thanks, Eva. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining from. New South Wales, it's really big, so it's great that we're able to work from home and join from the traditional lands of the Aboriginal people. In New South Wales, I'm joining you from Gadigal land. So what I'll be taking you through is how we define sludge, and then I'll hand over to Selena, who'll talk you through what we're doing about it. But before I do get into how we define sludge, I just want to give you a bit of a snapshot on the work that we've done so far to reduce sludge, and this is just a snapshot. On the next slide, where we've been doing this for a couple of years now, but collectively what we've been able to achieve has been really great. And I think, some of the case studies that you spoke to, Lucie, really show the real world impact of making these changes and the impact it can have in people's lives, not only in efficiencies, but also just in better outcomes. So in New South Wales, we've been able to complete over 40 sludge audits so far. We've also got many underway. It's reached more than 10 at this stage, just in the past week alone. We've also been training New South Wales public servants in how to reduce sludge in their processes, so over 500 to date, and we've developed a set of standard scales to measure the customer experience, and Selena will be taking you through those in a little while. And then if we look at the actual real world impact, these are just a few of the case studies, and you can see that they range across a whole lot of different policy areas. So we've got an increase in the number of patients taking up virtual care applications. You can see that we've also got savings in time for customers applying for different kinds of things. And also, even if we look at that last example, sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. Also, you can see that last example there. If we really think about real world impact, 11.4% increase in bookings for child health checks is a really great outcome. So with that snapshot, I'm going to take you through how we define sludge before I hand over to Selena, who'll get into the really exciting stuff about how we reduce it. So we have a definition up here from Professor Cass Sunstein, who defines sludge as the excessive or unjustified frictions that really detract from the customer experience. I won't read the whole thing. But what I really did want to emphasize here is that we define sludge as the excessive or unjustified friction. So we understand that, especially in the context of regulation, there do need to be some checks and balances in place for the integrity of services and to make sure that the right people are getting the right services. But what we define sludge as is the things that are actually making the people who are eligible and are the target of services and who would benefit from them. We're looking at removing the barriers to them accessing those services. And that's how we define sludge. And if we go to the next slide, we have a few examples of where we see sludge in New South Wales government. And I think this is probably pretty typical for a lot of governments. We don't put sludge there on purpose. It is unintentional, and where we typically see sludge is in information that's difficult to find and scattered across multiple websites on a singular topic. For example, forms that are hard to complete, wait times, especially when there's no update or people aren't given clear expectations about how long they're waiting or what the outcome of that wait will be, as well as complex decision points where people aren't made aware of the implications of certain decisions that they might make. And another point that I wanted to make about the definition of sludge on the next slide is about the fact that we see sludge as being more than just the things that get in the way of efficiency. We have a quote up here from Dilip Soman, who says and makes a really important point that sometimes the process itself might be efficient, but there are outcomes of the process that make people not want to engage. So when we think about those psychological and systemic barriers that make it difficult for customers in need to access services. So we have some examples of that up here when we talk about embarrassment, exclusion, distrust, and anxiety. Sludge can be anything that causes these feelings, which make people not want to continue with the process, even though it might be beneficial to them. And I think that point about exclusion is a particularly important one. often what we find when we look at services, so things like benefits and rebates, it's the customers who might most be in need of these services and most be in need of these benefits who are often excluded because of sludge, because they might not have access to resources such as time, money, proficiency in a certain language, ability to understand jargon. It's those people who are experiencing cognitive scarcity who are going to be most likely excluded because of sludge. So I hope I've been able to, I guess, show how important it is that we address this sludge because of its impacts. And now I'll hand over to Selena, who'll talk you through how we go about doing that.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm here to talk to you about some of the more practical aspects of what we do in our team and in New South Wales government when we're talking about sludge. And I think, hearing the examples that Lucie spoke about and hearing from Alex just now, I'm sure everyone is familiar with sludge. Everyone has experienced sludge, and it is a big problem in the way that it, just the scale of it, because it creeps into all sorts of processes and it's unintentional. So it's very easy for it to start to appear. And it seems like, I think on the surface of it, quite an overwhelming problem to try and tackle. But we have come up with a method that we use, and we hope that maybe for some of you it will demystify and maybe reduce some of those barriers to tackling sludge yourself, because if we can do it, so can you. So in New South Wales government, so we've created this sludge audit method, and Alex gave you a little teaser before of some of the impacts that we've seen using our method. But basically what it is it's a standardized method that we use to identify sludge, quantify the time, cost, and experience of interacting with New South Wales government, and use the metrics that we get from that to indicate where sludge might exist in government processes. And the inputs that we have used to develop this method come from a huge range of disciplines. So we've used behavioural insights, of course, but it also includes that CX and UX background, using their design ideas, and other best practice methods that we've come across in other international forums as well. Now, the way that we actually measure sludge, we have quite a few metrics, and the strength of having all of these different kinds of metrics is that you get a holistic image of what that sludge looks like. So we have time, cost, effort, and inclusion, and these form part of our sludge audit method. The inputs that we use to measure our sludge ranges from honestly any inputs that are available to the people who are doing the audit. So this can include things like customer feedback, or actually behavioural measures. So we might be looking at analysing customers' time spent on web pages or click-throughs, or number of applications submitted, or applications that need resubmission. So, and we can also talk to staff. The inputs come from all over the place, and we think that strengthens the results of your audit to show a more holistic picture of that customer experience. And we've also specifically designed our outputs in the method to help prioritize the frictions that need to be targeted with those behaviourally informed solutions. So I'll show you on the next slide all the steps that are involved, but ultimately this needs to be a practical method. And, we've tried to de-sludge the method as much as possible for the people who are doing audits as well, so that when they have these metrics, it's not just a what now question, it's how are we going to prioritize our target areas, because we know that there can be a lot of sludge in a process, and it's important to narrow down onto those bits that you have the resource to influence and you have the power to influence. So our sludge audit method contains 7 key steps, and I'll just walk you really quickly through what these steps are. Now, a lot of different organizations and teams will use behavioral journey mapping. And it's the first step of our process. But the difference with our behavioral journey mapping process is that it's quite comprehensive. So we start by developing our journey map and identifying all of the little micro behaviors that are involved in a customer's experience of a process. So this can include all the obvious behaviors that you would expect, like filling in a form, but it also includes all of those hidden behaviors. So making a decision, something like that is an interaction or a behavior that government might not have great insight into. It's not something that we can see on our end, but we know that it's happening. And we also know that it can take a lot of time and energy, and it can be a huge sludge point, for anxiety and a point where people drop out as well. So we need to make sure that we capture those behaviors. Now, the next step of the journey is gathering inputs. So when we say gather inputs, these are the ones like I mentioned before, customer feedback, staff experience, the behaviors that we can actually see customers performing. And we gather all those inputs to prepare us for the next 3 steps, which are all about inputting the relevant bits of information that we have into their respective spots in the sludge audit. The first step is our time audit. So here what we do is we estimate the amount of time customers spend on different behaviors in the process. So it's a great proxy for effort, and it's really, really key in identifying where the sludge exists, because immediately you can see, someone spending 3 hours on a form, and I think we can all agree that that is far too long to be spending. And the next step is the customer experience audit. So these two, I would say, are our sort of key input areas, the bits where we want to do a really thorough job. But the CX experience audit, so the customer experience audit, is the bit where we have applied the most amount of our effort in developing a metric that is really comprehensive and captures all the different kinds of behaviors and all the different levels of sludge that you might observe in a process. So what we do is we have, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail in the next couple of slides, but it's basically a systematic assessment of the customer experience using what we call sludge scales, which is something that we've developed, and I'll show you in a moment. Also included in our sludge audit method is access and equity checks. And these are basically a series of questions that you ask yourself, so prompts, which allow you to identify and flag any points in your process that hinder inclusivity. So, this might be the point at which you identify steps that really exacerbate that, anxiety that people might feel about a process, or really poor from an accessibility point of view. So we have a series of flags and prompts in this step here. And then step 6 is where it all comes together into the behavioural analysis. And the main outcome that we want from this step is that people are able to say they've identified all of the sludge in their process, and they've also been able to prioritise those behaviours for the steps in their process, which if they were to apply a behavioural solution, they'll be able to see the greatest impact for their customers. And yeah, from that point, we can focus on developing solutions for whatever focus areas that you've decided on. So to go into more detail on our sludge scales, which are the customer experience scales that we've just mentioned, we have created lots of different scales for basically any kind of common interaction point that you're likely to see in government. And the thing about government interactions is that there are a lot of repeated, in types of interactions that you'll have. So it might be about, and these are, steps that would occur within one process. So, you might be checking your eligibility for a rebate, and then you might be submitting an application for that rebate. And
you might have to read email notifications or letters, or you might have to make a payment. And these are the kinds of behaviors that we see over and over in government. So it made sense to actually consider them one by one and ask ourselves what best practice looked like for that kind of interaction for a customer when they're interacting with government. And here are some more examples of some of our access and equity checks. So these are the flags that we ask people to note down for each of the behaviors that they have in the behavioural journey map. And I think important to note is that a lot of this work is also underpinned by the New South Wales government's customer commitments. So these are the ones in the red table in the bottom right corner. So New South Wales government has made a commitment to make all of our processes easy to access, that we respect our customers' time, we explain what to expect, we act with empathy, we resolve the situation, and we engage the community. So a lot of these also underpin what we consider to be best practice in all of these interaction channels. So diving even deeper now, this is a specific example of what our scales look like. So this is for form design, and for each interaction point, we have multiple criteria that we'd be looking at, and each criteria would have multiple considerations as well. And you can see that these are specific to the actual channel that we're talking about. So we would be asking the auditor to look at each of the steps in that process and consider for form design, formatting, how well is formatting used to help the customer get to what they need to, and what visual techniques are used, and what guidance are they providing customers to help them understand the process and respond to those questions. And I know at this point you're thinking, how easy is it to answer these questions? But we always have extra help and extra suggestions and extra information for any point on that scale, for every single consideration, for every interaction point. So you can see here that we're quite specific with the kinds of things that we would expect to see at each level. And these ratings then go into creating the scores for each behaviour, which you can also use to provide an overall score for the whole process as well. And, we also provide that functionality for, if people aren't really sure where a behaviour sits, for example, they can just select that step itself, that consideration is somewhat difficult, rather than having to click all of them through, because we know that this is quite a comprehensive process, but it is up to the user how they decide they want to use the method as well. Great. Now, just to show you a quick case study about the way that we've used our sludge audit method in government. We have a lot of examples, but this is an early one that we like to share because I think it just demonstrated to us, and I think it can demonstrate for everyone else how powerful using a method like this can be. So in New South Wales, people who are applying for a builder's license need to apply to Fair Trading, which is our regulator, to get those licenses. And Fair Trading processes 40,000 of these applications a year. And the key point here is that builders can't progress with their work until they get a license. So every hour and day that is spent waiting on this license means another day that they can't start working. So the potential for impact is huge. And through our sludge audit, what we discovered is that it takes 26 hours to apply for a license, and 10 of these hours is just spent on collecting all the information that they need. So all of the identification, the documents that they need to upload to go with their submission. And what we also found is that 25% of these applications need follow-up. So builders can't get to work and they've made an error or something's gone wrong with their application, so they're needing to follow up. So that's 10,000 applications a year, and you can imagine how resource intensive 10,000 phone calls to government would be in a year as well. So what we did following this sludge audit is we identified these points as being high sludge points, and we introduced some behaviourally informed changes to the letter that they get, requesting that information so that people knew exactly what they needed to do and what they needed to collect to apply for this license and reduce the rate of error. And what we actually saw is that in implementing this changed letter, we saw a drop of 32% in the phone calls. So that follow-up that customers were doing before. And in real numbers, this means approximately 3,000 more builders are receiving their licenses quicker and not needing to make those phone calls. And that also equates to a government saving of approximately $80,000 a year. And again, trying to make this experience of using the sludge audit method as practical as possible, we have produced a whole suite of resources that New South Wales government can use to aid them in this process. So we have a web application that has been specifically developed to enable people to do their sludge audits online, including entering all their behaviours from the behavioural journey map, entering all the time estimates, entering the number of customers who will be affected by each step, and also the CX scales and everything, basically everything. So we've put the whole method into a single spot that people can go to, and they can revisit their audit, and they can also do things like follow-up audits to evaluate the effect of your impact. So if you've done an audit, introduced a solution, and you want to see what that impact was, you can do a follow-up audit and check whether those time estimates and those CX estimates have changed. We also have the audit tool also includes the sludge scales that I've shown you before, but we also have that as a separate document that you can read separately. We also have the sludge guides. So the sludge guides are for those people who have a specific channel that they'd like to desludge. So we have our guides, 6 of them, for things like, for instance, forms or emails or SMSs, websites. That this is a way of providing people with guidance on how to reduce sludge without having to go through the entire sludge audit process. Our sludge audit guide, just in the middle there, is our guide for how to do this method. So what I've just been telling you about, but in much more detail. And we also have the sludge audit templates, which are there to assist people with that data gathering step. So when they need to collect the time inputs or the CX inputs and the customer feedback, we have, customer feedback guides and guides for talking to staff about what they see in the process, as well as a way to record the data inputs that you're collecting as well. So that's it from us. We'd love to hear from you. So this is a bit of a call to action for you. Any work that you're doing about sludge or any questions you have about the work that we do, we'd love to hear from you.
Great, thanks for that comprehensive presentation and really nice background in terms of sludge administrative burden. So I think incredible amount of resources there. Colleagues are very keen to read those. So we'll put those in the chat for you. So yeah, we have a number of questions coming in already. Feel free to put them in the Q&A box. As I said, I'll take a few from the chat, but Q&A box from now on. Yeah, so let's get started. So there's a question I'll ask all of you on the panel here. It's a bit of a broader kind of overarching question with respect to changing business as usual and how you go about not only finding results, but how you actually work toward impact. So sometimes it can be a bit surprising, some of the findings that you find through experiments or the work that you do. So when you approach management or sort of decision makers about the work you do with administrative burden and sludge reduction, what's your kind of experience overall? Can it be maybe people realize maybe we're doing something unethical? What are those conversations like? What happens when you bring your results or your findings to decision makers? What's kind of the overarching impact and experience you have there? So maybe we'll start with New South Wales and then over to Lucie. So anyone from New South Wales, please feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to go first. Yeah, so look, I have to say the sludge audit method for us in itself has actually made that process a lot easier. So having these metrics that you can actually talk about the sludge in more tangible terms is really helpful. It's the difference between sort of saying, oh, yeah, we've got this painful process that we really need to make it better. It's the difference between that and saying, oh, actually we've got this process, customers are spending this much time at this point and this much effort, and talking and being able to talk about it in quantitative terms is actually really helpful and can be really powerful in getting the message across to senior leaders. We've found the reception's been really good. I think that not just from senior leaders, but other people that are working to do process improvement, that they see this kind of work as being complementary to service improvement, like the work that service designers do and others, and look, just having a way to be able to measure the impact. So the idea of having like a sludge audit isn't just to find the sludge, it's to have a baseline measure that you can then compare the impact afterwards. So even if you're not in a position where you can test using, a run RCT or A/B test or something, that you can still have a before and after measure where you've got these key metrics that you can report back on your impact. So yeah, for us, it's been a good way. Having a method and being able to measure it has been a really good way to persuade and appeal to decision makers.
And it sounds like you have really good principles from government already. I was amazed to see the government CX support from the government for behavioral science and sort of sludge reduction in general, which is amazing to see. Yeah, Lucie, over to you. What are your thoughts on general engagement with senior leaders, management when it comes to sludge reduction? What are your experiences?
Yeah, so my experience across the UN system so far has been that, people are very aware of administrative burdens and how they might be hampering, where they might be excessive, how they might be hampering program delivery or internal processes and so on. And usually they also already have a pretty good idea of where the problems are and why. But what they're sort of needing from behavioral science is a rigorous method that they can follow and some insights about the behavioral factors that can make these burdens actually so impactful. Because often you might sort of come with a already assumption that yes, it's a pain, but it's more like, maybe it's necessary and we can't do anything about it, or maybe it probably doesn't impact things that much. It's just one of those things. So what we can do as behavioral science practitioners is to come in with the method and the behavioral insights that can say, actually, this is why it matters, and this is how we can, do something about it. Now, in terms of rigorous testing and, will people actually be convinced to do something like a randomized control trial, an experiment with a business as usual group and then treatment groups to test the difference and the impact? That is definitely a conversation that needs to be had, because it's not necessarily the usual way of testing solutions in the UN, right? So what I found has worked well is, first of all, to highlight that right now, the current state of things is the business as usual. So you're not depriving people by, testing something, piloting something with a small group to see if it works. The second argument I usually use is that we don't actually know yet if the burden reduction intervention will work. That's the whole reason why we're testing it, right? So in order to try and avoid, overload people with interventions or spend lots of time and effort fully implementing something in the long term that we don't even know yet if it will fully work in the specific context that we're applying it in, because remember, we have best practice from behavioral science, but one of the insights is that behavior is very, very context specific. So it is worth first testing it and then implementing it broadly. And one last thing that we try to offer as well, if people are very reluctant to sort of, give the intervention to some people and not others, is to explain, okay, how about after we test the intervention, we give it to everyone if it has worked. And if it doesn't work, then, no harm done. And that way we can really make it obvious that the whole point is to test it for everyone and not to, already start implementing something that might be a waste of resources. But in general, explaining how these methods are part of behavioral science best practice can work as well. And just a more broader point, I suppose, is about, you need to convince senior leadership, but you also need to work very closely with the implementation team, especially when you're talking with the people who will be implementing the new process. There's no point redesigning a form if the people you're working with haven't bought into the idea of what you're doing and end up, still doing the old form on the side just to make sure they're not going to get in trouble or something. So it's really important to work really closely with your implementation team. And that way they will also kind of upskill through this process, be convinced of the value of behavioral science, your intervention is much more likely to be implemented more broadly and in other contexts if everyone understands what you're doing and why. So that would be my main advice for going about sort of setting up these sort of projects and speaking with leadership and with working level colleagues.
Great, thanks for that. Very comprehensive. I'm sure we could talk about this as a whole webinar in itself of how to actually take all these results and interesting findings forward. Okay, so maybe we get to a few technical questions, a few ones that have been sprinkled through. So there's some interest in learning a bit more about the access and equity checks. I know you mentioned it, Selena, already, kind of how you look at it, but maybe just diving a bit deeper into that section. And Lucie, too, if you want to comment on, and anyone else in New South Wales on the access and equity side. And then also there's a question about how you estimate users. So it can be tricky in different situations and contexts, depending what you're looking at, but maybe just some thinking around how you can make some estimates around these figures that you're developing in the metrics. So I'll turn it over to you to answer those two specific things. And then also put your questions in the chat. I might turn it over to you if you would like to speak. So I might go to Sarah, you next. If you want to come online, you can ask the question yourself. Okay, so but over to those. So access and equity checks, and then also how do you measure users? Over to you.
Yeah, there's some really great questions, and in fact, our access and equity checks are the latest addition to our sludge audit method. We're always looking for ways that we can improve upon it. The access and equity checks came about because with the customer experience audit element, that is very channel based. So you saw the example that Selena showed. It's very specific to the type of channel that you're looking at along each step of the journey. But we also wanted to make sure that every single step was inclusive and that there wasn't anything that was hampering the equity of a service. So we developed a series of prompting questions. There are 6 in total, and they're designed such that the auditor would, for every single step in the process that they've mapped out, they'd ask each of the 6 prompting questions. So they relate to, the questions include things like, mark every step in your process where the user or the customer needs to provide the same information more than once. Or mark every step in the process where the user or customer doesn't have the ability to personalize or adapt the way that they intake information. So they can't adjust the size of the text, for example. So that's another prompting question. And then there's also ones about mark every step where the user doesn't know why they're being requested to wait, or they don't know what's going on behind the scenes, because it's important to have that operational transparency. So there's these 6 questions which I guess capture anything that we might have missed in that customer experience audit, which, as I said, might prevent our processes from being equitable. So I hope that answers that question. And then in relation to coming to estimates of the number of people, I mean, as Eva's touched on, really we see our sludge audit as a tool for service owners to improve their services. So we don't claim that it's 100% accurate, but there are a couple of different data sources that we recommend that people look to. So obviously it's very easy, and I think someone put in the chat and made this comment, it's very easy if you look at online services, because you can just look at Google Analytics and hit rates and things like that. So that would be the first port of call. You can also speak to customers, and when you feel as though you've kind of reached saturation point with customer interviews, you can use that as a bit of an indication about the number of customers and where dropouts are and things like that. Also looking at customer feedback and historical data in that way. So there's a range of different data sources that we recommend, and we have the templates that Selena showed and guides that help people decide, firstly, what do they have and what do they have the ability to start to search for.
Great, thanks for that. Lucie, do you have any comments on those questions? No? Okay. Okay. So maybe we'll go over to some of you to interact with our panelists as well. So Sarah, I can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question yourself. Just give me 1 second. Would you like to? If not, I can also ask it for you. You can speak now if you'd like.
Hi, thank you so much for the great presentations. My question was about how to design sludge-free processes to begin with. So do you have any guidance or resources on how to embed that kind of thinking in organizations that you could share with us? Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That's a great question. In our case, we can do prospective sludge audits, and we have. So that involves, it's a slightly different process when we're doing the journey mapping, when we're trying to, design a service, but it is similar. It gives us an opportunity to think in advance about what are some of the potential frictions. So we just use it a different way, but the sludge audit does enable us to do that. So to give an example of something that we've worked on was when we were doing a review of some legislation. So we're thinking kind of at a more sort of policy level around how we're going to take sludge out of a process. And to do that, we were sort of working on different potential journeys that the customer would have to go down, and with different kind of, depending on the different approaches that we might take, and thinking in advance about how that journey might play out for them. So so we've been able to do it prospectively, and we also have in our department. So it's not just sludge audits. We have a whole sort of multidisciplinary group of practitioners who use methods like service design and others to when we're sort of starting from scratch and developing a new service.
Yeah, and maybe from a UN perspective, I suppose I don't have much to add because that's very comprehensive, but just to say that, as many in the audience might know, a lot of the parts of the UN are earlier on in their behavioral science journey yet, and because of the nature of the UN system, there are a lot of legacy processes that we have kind of our hands full looking at all the different administrative burdens that we might identify and reduce. So that's definitely kind of more of a focus. But the great thing that I've started to notice is that when you start being sort of in that mindset, and the people that you've worked with on the project become more and more aware of administrative burdens and recognizing them and what some frictions might have impact on what people and so on, then they start to design more sludge-free processes as they go on about their work. So for example, in the FAO project that I showed you, now when the team that worked on this project prepares new training sessions, or maybe wants to design sort of an employee guide on employee benefits, they have all of this knowledge and they can avoid adding extra administrative burdens now that they know how it works and what to watch out for, I suppose. So I find that to be a really positive sort of scaling impact of doing behavioral science projects with UN teams, is that once they learn from the specific case study that we've done, they can then go and apply that knowledge to other processes, and that helps keep those new processes sludge-free as they work on them.
Great, thanks for that. Lots of learning by doing, and what we're hoping to do here at Behavioral Science across the UN. Okay, so now I have a few questions geared towards Lucie, but I think they are relevant to definitely what New South Wales spoke about as well. So there's one about email communication, big organizations, and I think you have a sludge guide on email or some sort within that domain. So maybe touching upon that in particular, and how other evidence-based solutions and how management can be approached about this, and also how we can reflect upon email communication, and how do we train people as well. So email broadly. And then also there's a question about, doing these projects more generally, but perhaps for Lucie, is there something that surprised you, or any unintentional consequences or biases introduced when trying to get people to do something? You might try to improve a process, but are there spillovers, unintentional, good or bad? Maybe thinking about the broader picture as well. So email, and then just when you run projects generally, how do you deal with the unintended consequences? It seems like you have very thorough methods, but how do you tackle the things that maybe you didn't expect from the outset in the work that you do? So yeah, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so we do have a guide about email communication, and that's evidence-based. So anyone is welcome to have a look at that. I think the key with big organizations as well is often it's a cultural thing, and it's almost a behavioral problem in and of itself to try and shift the culture of organizations and how they write to their staff. And something that our government, I think, does quite well is all the corporate emails that go out will say things like 2-minute read at the top. It tells you what to expect, tells you how long you should be, expecting that email to be. And, they effectively use things like chunking, and they use the formatting, they're bolding headings in a consistent way. And it just makes that reading process so much easier, because you are reading content that's presented in the same way every time. So that's something that we know has worked. I think something else to mention is, because it's a big organizations with so many people, and you're trying to shift behaviors of all these different people. Yeah, that's definitely an opportunity for behavioral interventions. And maybe some of that is modeling. So you get your senior managers to uptake first, and then you get that culture to filter down, hopefully. But in terms of training, I'm not sure if I have any specific recommendations as to how to train people on something like that. But we do things like workshops, not on such a huge scale. But I think if you identify the key people who would be likely to be a good model, or who have large reach within the organization, then that would be a good person to start with that kind of training. And I think something that is done pretty frequently is you'll get them to bring an example of an email that they've written and rewrite it, work on it in the session. So you're learning by doing as well. So that's definitely something that we do. And what was the second part of that question? Sorry.
Unintended consequences, anything surprising that you find along the way? How do you deal with those things?
Well, our team's background is in behavioral insights and behavioral science, and we're still big believers in things like RCTs. And if we can test it, if we can do a robust evaluation of the changes that we're making, then we like to do that as well. The thing with sludge, though, is that it is absolutely everywhere, and there are lots of little changes and big changes that you can be making to improve a process, and it might not be feasible to test every single change that you make, because RCTs are very difficult to run and are very resource intensive and take a long time. So I think in part we would maybe see some unexpected consequences, but it's up to, it's everyone's responsibility, I think, when you're working in that process improvement space it's not just a one and done. You have to continuously evaluate and monitor that process. So this is why we really recommend doing those follow-up sludge audits, check in with your process again. Don't just do the audit, implement a solution and say, okay, we're done with that process, because the follow-up sludge audit is where you might find some of those unintended consequences coming up as well.
Great, thanks for that, Lucie.
Yeah, I might weigh in just on the sort of surprising things aspect, I suppose, is a lot of these surprises were positive. So first, I was surprised at how easy it was to, I expected that I would have to really convince people about the intervention and why every behavioral insight that I implemented in the intervention, why I was doing it and so on. But in fact, everyone I worked with was sort of very enthusiastic about behavioral science, very eager to apply best practice, and that wasn't an issue at all. On the other hand, technical issues played a much bigger role in actually running a behavioral science project than I expected. So don't underestimate, I would say, the importance of having, your IT team and your data team and so on board, and to sort of set aside time to sort out all of these challenges, because they might surprisingly be more of an issue than the actual behavioral insights that you're trying to implement. Another kind of surprisingly and kind of positive challenge in a way in the FAO project I mentioned on employee benefits training was that one of the barriers to attendance was in a way pretty positive, because people thought, I don't really need to attend this training or to make a benefits claim because I work for a great employer, the UN, they will take care of me. And I sort of trust them to do the right thing if I were to get into an accident and needed these benefits. So that was really interesting, because it's something we wouldn't have thought of if we only looked at sort of existing materials, because it's not one of the commonly listed, behavioral barriers, of course, to attending employee trainings or to claiming benefits. So that was a good reminder that, behavior and administrative burdens and their impact are very context specific. And it's so important to do a proper user journey mapping and understand what the actual factors at play are. So those were just some of the things that surprised me.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, so we're over time, but if we can take one more question, maybe I'll leave the last one for all of you. And so maybe a big one, I think it's a bigger picture from where we are with the examples we've looked at today. So there's interest from Michelle as well as IU about looking at policies, rules, and regulations. So we've talked about sort of user-facing processes, and that's great. There's lots of, we can see potential for sludge reduction, but to what extent and how have you possibly reflected upon applying sludge reduction to policies, rules, and regulations at a bit of a bigger level? So Yeah, over to you, or even if the potential of this, even if you haven't done it yourselves, maybe to what extent should we be doing this or looking into this area?
Yeah, great question. So in our case, look, we are still early on in our sludge journey, but definitely the vision is to get more involved in sort of the upstream policy development. We have been starting to do more in regulation. So for example, we're working at a program level to reduce sludge. So it's not just sort of disparate processes, but looking at a whole program, looking at the regulation, the policy that sits behind it, because often we find that, particularly when we're talking about sludge, that isn't just about administrative burden and those kind of frictions. We're talking about sludge that's starting to get into is not being inclusive or targeting certain groups disproportionately. That's when a lot of policy can really help to alleviate some of that sludge. So we have confronted that in some of the processes, and we have been able to get more involved. I think I mentioned before, we've been involved in a review of legislation relating to regulation of building contracts, and there's so we have had the opportunity to feed in very early into that process and have our insights embedded. So but not something that I'd say that we're doing systematically, but definitely something that's growing and where there's a lot of interest in. Actually, we're finding that as we've been doing more sludge audits, getting some results, people are starting to wanting us to be involved earlier in the process, or when they are thinking about really kind of overhauling something. So that's been something that we've been able to do because we've been able to sort of demonstrate some impact.
Great, thanks for that, Lucie. I know it's in the Secretary General's guidance note that we should be doing this. So what are your thoughts on this area?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the fact that we have sort of senior leadership saying at a very high level in UN, official documents, we need to be looking at reducing burdens across the system is a sort of very powerful thing, because it generates a lot more interest across the UN family of people wanting to get involved, wanting to understand a bit better what administrative burdens are, for example, through these sort of events and materials and resources that we sort of try to put out. And then I also very much relate to what Eva was just saying about, when you start to show value with one sort of well-designed, really rigorous project, and you show how you can actually have a positive impact, it's not an empty exercise to be identifying and reducing administrative burdens, then teams become more and more open to actually implementing best practice and using rigorous behavioral science methods and sort of going the next step. So one example that I like to share is, with this FAO project, we focused mostly on getting people to attend training on these employee benefits. But the next step is that we are now sort of learning of other teams across the UN who we're sort of providing a bit of input and advice, who are now wanting to simplify the process of claiming benefits itself in other contexts. So this can sort of snowball, and as people become more aware and become more convinced of the added value of behavioral science and see the actual impact, then more opportunities to sort of implement this best practice open up, I'd say.
Great, that's a nice note to end the webinar on, of where we can go with things in the future and how things can potentially snowball to reduce sludge across organizations. So with that, thank you very much for all of your time and effort over the panel today to share this is just the tip of, I think, what everyone's working on. But yeah, really exciting. And we'll share the resources and the recording of this webinar in the UN Innovation Network's library. So check that out for those of you who want to access the recording. And yeah, great. Thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you at a webinar soon.